Hey folks, Eric Metaxas here. Before taking Nutrimetics, I looked and felt, well, like this. And now look at me. Nutrimetics all-natural supplements enhance immunity, energy, overall health, and they might even cure baldness.
It doesn't cure baldness.
Whatever. The point is, if you want to feel great, go to Nutrimetics.com and use the code ERIC for huge savings. Folks, we have a very special guest. Oh my gosh. I don't know how to do this. Because, let's start with the most important thing. My guest is Greek. She speaks the Greek language. She goes to the Greek church. And her name is Jeannie Constantinou. Dr. Constantinou, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's nice to see you. Yasu.
Yeah, Yasu. And I say Evgenia just because I feel the pressure to pronounce it that way. But you go by Eugenia or how
yes, or just Dr. Jeannie for the
Jeannie.
podcast. Jeannie is fine.
Dr. Jeannie. Look, you before we have too much fun, I want to be really clear. You've been teaching biblical studies and early Christianity at the University of San Diego since 2002. You taught New Testament at the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in the Massachusetts. No.
Right. Yes, that's
in
right.
Massachusetts.
Brookline, Massachusetts. That's right.
Because I'm on the East Coast, and
yes, I know.
I
it's
know
Northeast.
that you're there. But your husband is a Greek Orthodox priest.
That is correct.
And so you really are presbytera.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Presbytera είσαι.
Δεν το ήξερες αυτό? Δεν το ήξερες?
Το ξέχασα. Αλλά το ξέχασα. Okay, so we have a lot to talk about. Now, the main focus of our conversation, I want to be, you have a brand new book out. I've been very excited about this. It's called The Crucifixion. Now, folks, listen to this. This is really beautiful. The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, the amazing history and sublime mystery of the Passion. Yes. Now, I'm excited about this for reasons. Maybe I should try to let you explain this, but the way I would sum it up is that I'm a generalist. I don't have a PhD, but generally speaking, I find that people who are generalists or people who work rather than saying maybe generalists or popularizers or populists, they're multidisciplinary. Yes. And when you're multidisciplinary, it gives you sometimes an opportunity to see things from a perspective that the experts don't see. You can put, you can connect dots because you're at some remove in a way. And that's, I think, your strength. And so in this new book, because we talked with you last year, but in the new book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, the amazing history and sublime mystery of the Passion, you do this. So help us understand the way into this. What do you cover here, and what is your perspective that's different?
Yes, thank you very much for asking that question, Eric, because there is a difference. And you made an excellent point by speaking about yourself as a generalist and a person who has a perspective from a long view about history and other current topics. Well, me as a Bible scholar, I'm in the weeds. I'm in the thick of all of the details of this subject. But the reason why my book is different, I think, I haven't read anything like it before, is not only am I a biblical scholar, but I'm also an attorney. I have a lot of expertise reading medical records from my years as an attorney. And also I have some background in Roman law, because I wrote my thesis for Harvard Divinity in Roman trial procedures in the first century in the provinces. So I'm wanting to answer a lot of questions. My problem is, when I was reading books about the crucifixion or Bible commentaries, it seems that nobody combined all of the different skills and expertise that I think I bring to this subject.
Okay, so excuse me. So you just to be really clear, like I was sort of saying, I'm an expert in nothing. I have a PhD in nothing. You're an expert in several things. So really the issue here is the multidisciplinary approach that somebody
Correct.
who is, I mean, you're a scholar in New Testament, but you are a scholar in other disciplines. And so, yes, when you look at the story of the passion, the crucifixion, the trial of Jesus, you also bring your expertise as a lawyer. And it seems to me that the most exciting work is being done by people who are working in multiple disciplines. And so I want to be clear, because I don't want to exactly, there's a general thesis here, right? That if you're looking at things and you're not only looking from one perspective, and there's nothing wrong with looking at things from one perspective, but you bring that, and you specifically bring that in this book. So that's what we're talking about.
That's exactly right. So there's so many books that have already been written about the Passion of Christ, and they're by pastors or religious leaders. And then those books are sort of talking about the spiritual implications or the spiritual lessons. Or I've read a lot of commentaries, and the commentaries are people who are experts in biblical studies, but they might not know, let's say, Roman law the way I do, or they might not have the expertise with medical information the way I do. So I'm combining all of my expertise in all of these various areas and trying to synthesize what I learned and answer some of my own questions about the passion and the crucifixion of Christ that I had for many years, and try to present it to ordinary people. Because for people who have questions about what happened historically to Christ, it's very, very difficult for them to get good answers from a person who has a real depth of experience and who can evaluate the other writings. Because if you go to read about, for example, there are doctors who wrote about the crucifixion of Christ, but they don't know about Roman law, or they don't know about first century Judaism, or they're not experts in biblical studies. So because I have an expertise in virtually all of these areas, I can really present what happened in a very concise way, but also in a very readable way, because I tried to keep the story of the Passion in more of a narrative format and interweave this information into the story and keep it something that the ordinary intelligent reader could understand, not so highfalutin and not so technical. Because I read all of those technical articles. I read all the medical articles about the various things that would have happened to Christ, and also in general, the kinds of wounds that he suffered. And I read all of those historical writings by Jewish scholars and writings by Roman scholars and things like this. So I'm trying to present that so that a person can just benefit from the research that I did.
Well, I'm thrilled you've done it. Now, what are some of the things that might surprise us? You talk about I think you were talking about the exact date, or the exact, there are a number of things that you seem to have stumbled upon that I got really excited when I heard about it. So talk about some of that.
There were so many of them. It surprised me the extent to which the crucifixion really fulfilled prophecies that we kind of knew were fulfilled, but the extent to which they were fulfilled, and the extent to which the crucifixion of Christ corresponded to many sort of foreshadowings in Jewish history. And one example would be the binding of Isaac. What Jews call the binding of Isaac and Christians call the sacrifice of Isaac. We all know that was sort of a foreshadowing of the sacrifice of the only Son of God by Abraham. But there's so much more to it, because the binding of Isaac is very, very important in Jewish history. And I did not know that Jews believe that happened on the 14th day of Nisan, which is exactly the date that Jesus Christ was crucified on the eve of the Passover.
Okay, right now, right there, right? Like so that's the first one. I just want to say one.
There's a lot of them.
Bullet point. But I'm saying that's a big one. The beauty of this is that what you're doing, of course, is you are encouraging us in our faith. Like, if you think it's amazing, it's like you don't even know how amazing. Here's another parallel. Here's another staggering parallel you just mentioned. When we come back, we're going to cover all of these. I'm talking to Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Dr. Constantinou, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory is the book. Folks, this is your daily reminder to please go to mypillow.com or mystore.com, and to get huge savings, use the code ERIC. If you don't believe me, here's some celebrity friends.
Mama said to use the code ERIC.
Use the code ERIC.
Eric.
Thank you very much. Λοιπόν, γεια σας, παιδιά. We are speaking Greek here in the Eric Metaxa show. Actually, we can't do that. We have to speak English.
That's
Dr. Jeannie, Eugenia Constantinou, it's so great to have you. I'm excited about the book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. You were just talking, and I want to cover as much of this as we can. You just talked about something. Now, there's some people who are familiar with this, some people who aren't. So let's go back. When Isaac was brought by his father Abraham, and he was going to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah.
Right.
First of all, I know that there are people who say where that took place. This is a prefiguring, of
That's
the
right.
sacrifice of Jesus by his father. There's a lot of information that says that where Abraham did this was the same place where Jesus was crucified. Do you go into that?
It wouldn't have been exactly the same place, excuse me, but the Jewish tradition is that Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac, or he was willing to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, is the location of the Temple Mount. So Jesus was not crucified on the Temple Mount,
Right.
but in the city of Jerusalem. But the parallel between Abraham and Isaac and Jesus' sacrifice is much deeper than even just that. It's the fact that this was very fascinating to me. So Jewish authors write about this binding, what they call the binding of Isaac. The binding of Isaac is very important in the Jewish mentality, and it's connected to Passover. And that's not something that we as Christians would ordinarily expect. But there was a lot of discussion, and it still is part of the Jewish tradition, that Isaac was willing to be sacrificed. And we don't really think about that. We always focus on Abraham and how difficult it was for him to be offering his son to the Lord. But actually, the hero in the story is Isaac, because he was willing to be sacrificed. And lots of early Jewish writings, even before the time of Christ, talk about the voluntary binding of Isaac by himself.
This is news. This is news. I have never heard this before. And this is extraordinary.
Yes.
And you're familiar with the early Jewish writings. So you're telling us something right now that we didn't know, which obviously would be a tremendous parallel. And you would think would lead Jews who don't believe Jesus is the Messiah to consider that he might be, because what a curious parallel. But then you mention the date. I have never heard this.
Yes.
On the 14th day of Nisan. Talk about that.
Well, the Jewish tradition, because Isaac, Abraham was told by God to go offer Isaac as a burnt offering on Mount Moriah, on the land of Moriah, then the mountain there. That's in Genesis chapter 22. When he says this, they walk for 3 days, and Isaac is carrying the wood for the sacrifice. And Isaac begins to ask his father, where's the lamb for the sacrifice? Of course, he has no idea that he's supposed to be the sacrifice, right? And Abraham says, God will provide the lamb, my son. So when they arrive there, he finds out that he's going to be the sacrifice, but he's willing, because he's a grown man. He's not a little kid by this time, or he's at least a youth. So in the Jewish tradition, this is not mentioned in Genesis itself, but in the hundreds and hundreds of years that the Jews talked about this story, they came to understand that Isaac was a willing participant. And this was remember that the Jewish people are not just descended from Abraham, because the Arab people are too. They're descended from Abraham through Isaac. And so it was believed that when they were liberated from slavery in Egypt, it is through the merits of Isaac that they won this liberation. And so there are many, many parallels about the binding of Isaac with the story of Jesus. And after walking for 3 days, this is again Jewish tradition. You won't find this unless you read Jewish authors, which is what I did in my research. You'll find that they arrived at Mount Moriah, and he was going to sacrifice Isaac on that specific date. And then later, rabbis would talk about this, and they would say that Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice as one who carries his cross on his back, because he carried the wood on his back.
Wait. The Jewish writers mention the cross?
They don't mention the cross of Jesus. They say Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice on his back the way a man carries his cross.
Well, no, that's
The
what I'm
wood of the
saying, but they
cross, yeah.
mentioned
Yes,
the
they do.
parallel with the way
Yes,
a
they
man
do.
carries his cross.
Yes,
This is the Jewish writers.
yes,
They
yes.
don't believe Jesus is the Messiah,
That's right.
but they're making this parallel themselves.
They are. And these parallels were made before the crucifixion of Christ. You see, that's the important thing. They were not, people would say, well, that they would just got this idea from the crucifixion. No, no, no. Most of these ideas and parallels were recognized among first century Jews before the rise of Christianity. And that's very important. This means that God prepared the Jewish people for the coming of the Messiah and for the death of the Messiah in this particular way. So many Jews, we get this idea that the Jews did not accept Jesus, but that is not true. Thousands and thousands of believers in Jerusalem itself came to faith in Jesus Christ. And this was after Pentecost. And remember, the death of Jesus was only weeks prior, and they all knew who he was, and they all knew how he died. So if we read the book of Acts, we can see how the church grew in Jerusalem. So many people were able to make that connection.
Okay, here's the question. Why haven't we heard about this? Because this is big news to me. This is important, groundbreaking scholarship on your part that you're making this connection. What's the last time anyone made this connection? Is it 2,000 years ago? Is it 200 years ago?
I think that this is known among some Bible scholars. They get this and they know these things. But that was my point in writing the book. These are things that are kind of known in we could say upper echelons of scholarly circles. But it hasn't really come down to the people in a way that they can understand and explain to them that the true significance. And this is just one thing. We're still talking about Isaac. There's so many other amazing things that I discovered that are parallels. And the Christ is the fulfillment of so many prophecies and expectations for the Jewish people. So it's not that it's unknown. I didn't discover something brand new that nobody else knows. I just read all of these different books and articles, and I brought all of this information forward.
Okay, that's kind of what I was saying about what I often do. I mean, the book right here is Atheism Dead. I didn't discover these things, but I thought to myself, yet no one knows these things, so I need to write about it in a popular way, because this stuff is too fascinating for everyone not to know. We need to know this. So this is why I'm so excited about your book, because it's a book for everybody, and nothing could be more important than what you write about in this book. So the book, again, folks, is called The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, The Amazing History and Sublime Mystery of the Passion by Jeannie Constantinou. Now, let's go into some more of the parallels and the things that you've discovered.
Okay, well, another one that I thought was very fascinating and really important to me is, for example, the piercing of Christ after he's dead, right? This is something that is only discussed by John the evangelist. And it's one of the things that's fascinating to me and also somewhat disappointing as a Bible scholar is how many Bible scholars do not believe the truthfulness of the gospel accounts of the crucifixion of Christ. They dismiss many of the details as unhistorical. And some of them don't believe, for example, that either Jesus was actually pierced or that out of his side came blood and water. I talk about the medical reasons why this would have happened, but they are very dismissive of this. And yet John emphasizes again and again in three ways. He emphasizes that he really saw this, and this is really true. He says it 3 times that he was a witness to this. And the question then is, why does he emphasize this so much? Why is it so important? And he quotes a couple of the prophecies that, again, as Christians, we know because we've read the Gospel of John, but we don't recognize their importance. One of the ones he quotes is, they will look upon him whom they have pierced. And the other one is, not a bone of his will be broken. Well, the not breaking of bones is a direct correlation to the Passover lamb. They were forbidden to break the bones of the lamb when they ate the lamb. There's a whole nother story with the correlation between Christ as the lamb and the sacrifice of the Passover lambs. But the other one about the piercing is very fascinating because he quotes a Zechariah prophecy. They will look upon him whom they have pierced. But whenever a gospel writer or any New Testament writer quotes something from the scriptures, their scriptures, which were the Jewish scriptures, we have to recognize that they are quoting that particular part, but you should really go back and read the whole thing. Well, here's what the actual prophecy of Zechariah says. It says, it's God speaking, because remember, God is speaking through Zechariah in the first person. They will look upon me, upon the one whom they have pierced. God is the one who is speaking. God is the one who is pierced. They will look upon me, upon the one who is pierced, and they will mourn over me like a firstborn son. So the point of the piercing is that the fulfillment of the prophecy is not just that Jesus was pierced, and so it adds to the fulfillment of prophecy, but that he is God. It is God who was pierced.
This is huge. This is beautiful.
Huge.
We've got lots more with Jeannie Constantinou. The Crucifixion of the King of Glory is the book. We'll be right back. The Democrats' big spending socialist agenda is threatening the economy. Americans should be concerned and prepared for the consequences. President Trump ushered in a booming economy, one that is now in jeopardy. It's never been more important to diversify your financial portfolio with gold. When investing in gold and precious metals, the company I trust most is Legacy Precious Metals. They are experts at helping Americans protect and build their wealth. And if you're looking for financial security from a firm you can trust, contact Legacy Precious Metals today. Folks, I'm talking to Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Yeah, that's Greek. It's extremely Greek. Zito y helada.
Zito.
We were just saying off the air, Dr. Jeannie, as you now, what do you go by, Dr. Jeannie?
Well, in the podcast world, I have a podcast, Search the Scriptures.
Yeah.
You can find it at orthodoxbiblestudy.info. And the people call me Dr. Jeannie. But
Okay.
not my students. They shouldn't do that. I'm Dr. Constantinou to
Right.
them.
Who do they think they are?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I was mentioning that I'm my wife and I will be in San Diego at the end of this month, like soon, at the end of March.
Yeah.
And I realized the day I'm going to be there is Ikos Pempti Martiu, a
Zito
big
y
day
helada.
in the Greek world.
Greek Independence Day.
Ito.
Oh, yeah.
I'm wearing the Greek colors to celebrate the
There you go.
Greek history. But I would really just look forward to meeting you and your
great.
husband, Father Kostas. Wow,
That would be great.
be great. We're talking about your book, which really, of course, is released in time for
Mhm,
Lent, for this
mhm.
holy time in the
Yes.
church. It's called The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. You're talking about some things, people who are really familiar with the Bible. A lot of evangelicals know some of
Yes.
these things.
Yes.
But there are tons of people that are not aware of just the outrageous treasures, the parallels, that if you weren't convinced that the Bible is the word of God, that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is God, if you weren't convinced, you start looking into it and you go, this is
Wow.
bizarre. Like, is this a coincidence? So you're a scholar in multiple disciplines, and you've observed a number of things. I want to just keep going with various
things.
parallels, things that you've discovered that are
Sure.
in this book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory.
Sure. Thank you. And there are so many fascinating things I discovered. And we could talk a little bit more about, if you want, about fulfillment of prophecy and some of these typologies fulfilled. But there are also fascinating things about Pilate, about the darkness on the day that Christ died. I had sent you a little excerpt from that.
That's what I want to talk about right now.
Okay.
The
All right.
darkness.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Well, see, this is something that is usually dismissed as unhistorical by many, even Bible scholars. They just assume, well, this didn't really happen, because according to the Gospels, there was darkness for 3 hours, that the sun went dark when Christ was on the cross. And people say, well, this is sort of a fantasy. It's a symbolic darkness representative of evil, or some apocalyptic darkness, this kind of thing. But actually, we have to remember that the evangelists, when they wrote these books, they were writing for the people of their day. And if there hadn't been a darkness, they would not have said that, because people would have said, they would have lost credibility. People would have said that never happened. And remember that these books, the four Gospels, are four independent accounts of the crucifixion, the ministry and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, written by 4 different people in 4 different places and 4 different times, and yet they are remarkably consistent, especially about the crucifixion. And so they talk about the darkness on the day that Christ died, but people, because we're so, into this scientific expectations that we have to be able to explain everything, we don't allow room for the miraculous very often in our society. But God does not conform to the laws of nature. He's not required to do that. So there is actually some evidence that there really was an earthquake and also darkness and unnatural darkness on the day Christ died. Now, most people say that this was an eclipse, okay? They say, well, there was an eclipse, or they try to explain it away as some natural occurrence, but it could not have been an eclipse because an eclipse does not take place during the full moon, and Passover always happens during the full moon. An eclipse can only happen, an eclipse of the sun can only happen when there is a new moon, when the moon is in between the sun and the earth and it blocks the rays of the sun. But at a full moon, which is when Passover takes place, the moon is behind the earth. Okay, so it could not have been an eclipse, and no eclipse lasts for 3 hours. But there was an ancient Greek historian who was a contemporary of Christ who did mention this darkness, an unnatural darkness on the day that Jesus Christ died. Of course, he doesn't say that on the day Christ died, this is what happened, because he's a pagan. But he was trying to dismiss Christian claims about Jesus being the Son of God. And so he says, oh, this was just an eclipse. But the very fact that his name was Thallos, and he was writing around the year 55.
Thalos?
Thallos, writing
Thallos.
around the year 55. So that particular document was lost. You see, part of our problem here, Eric, is that most of the writings of antiquity have not been preserved, okay? We have only maybe 10% of all the books that existed at the time of Christ in antiquity. So many of those writings were lost. So the idea that everything should be documented is a kind of a fallacy. We can't possibly document everything, but there is evidence that there was a writer because other writers quote him.
Okay, I mean, look, half of what we know is from writers quoting other writers, definitely.
That's right.
I never
exactly.
heard of this first century Greek named Thalos.
Yes.
Where do we find what he wrote? We just got seconds left in this segment. Go ahead.
His writing did not survive. It was a history of the Eastern Mediterranean, but his writing did not survive. But he was quoted by another person, Julius Africanus, who was then quoted by another person. And Africanus says there was no eclipse that year, and NASA tells us there was no eclipse that year. And yet there is Thalos and another person named Phlegon, a later historian, a few decades later, who also mentioned the darkness.
Okay, we're going to be back, folks. If you're not fascinated, you're just not paying attention. We're going to be right back. The book is The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. Jeannie Constantinou is my guest. Hey folks, Eric Metaxas here. Before taking Nutrimetics, I looked and felt, well, like this. And now look at me. Nutrimetics all-natural supplements enhance immunity, energy, overall health, and they might even cure baldness.
It doesn't cure baldness.
Whatever. The point is, if you want to feel great, go to Nutrimetics.com and use the code ERIC for huge savings. Folks, welcome back. I'm talking to Jeannie Constantinou about her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. What you just said, and I have to say, I am absolutely fascinated by this kind of thing.
Yes.
You were just saying that a first century Greek named Thalos, who's a pagan, writes about the darkness that occurred, that when we read the Gospels, it says that there was darkness when Jesus died on the cross.
When he was on the cross.
It's always been a mystery. It's always been a mystery. People say it was an eclipse. You're saying astronomically, we know that it could not have been an eclipse.
That's right. Because of the way the Jews celebrate Passover during the full moon, not the new moon. And also NASA, because I went to the NASA website to find out whether or not there were any eclipses within that period of time in that part of the world, total solar eclipses, and there weren't. And this is what Julius Africanus, an early father of the church, said in defense of the historicity of the Gospels. He says there wasn't an eclipse that year. He himself checked the astronomical records. This is one of the easiest things to do, to see whether or not there was an eclipse. But that doesn't mean that the darkness didn't happen, because Salos was trying to disprove Christian claims. That's the fascinating part. He was trying to disprove Christian claims. And that's why Africanus, this other early church writer, is refuting him by saying this was not an eclipse. He was saying, oh, that was just an eclipse. Jesus wasn't the Son of God.
Okay,
So
wait. So just
really
so if I'm
fascinating.
tracking,
Yeah,
you said in 55 AD, which is extremely early.
very
I mean,
early.
most of the New Testament hadn't been written. Okay,
That's
so this
right.
is right in the beginning of the beginning. You have a Greek pagan
Mhm.
trying to refute what the Christians are claiming and sweeping it away, saying, oh, it's just an eclipse. What's the big deal? But then we look back and we find out, no, there was no eclipse, which, I mean, look, whether it was an eclipse or wasn't, I mean, we now know
Exactly.
it wasn't. But the point is, this is underscoring the idea that they were grappling with this claim, this widespread claim
Yes.
that there was darkness
That's
over
right.
the land
That's
when
right.
Jesus was on the cross. So it's fascinating
That-
from
that's
every
right.
point of view.
That's right. That's the whole point. The point is it indirectly verifies the gospel accounts of the darkness. And then there's another writer, Phlegon, of the early 2nd century, that's like 100, 120, something like this. And he says that it was so dark that stars were visible in the sky, and also mentions an earthquake on the same date. And there's an earthquake that is mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, and people just dismiss these things as unhistorical.
What
But
does
the fact
Phlegon
is-
say, and where's Phlegon writing
Yeah,
from? What's
he's another Greek pagan historian, and so all the again, we don't have all of the entire history of these people, but the reason why we know about them is because these pagan writers who were trying to dispute Christian claims were quoted by Christian authors like Jerome and like Origen and early Christian authors to refute them. So they were reading their books. Those books were still around when these early Christian writers were writing, you see. So
Right.
even though the pagan writings haven't survived, we know what the Christian authors were saying against them. So we know what they were saying because the Christian authors preserved their arguments against Christianity, you see.
This is so wonderful. I'm always exhilarated and horrified at things like this, because I think to myself, how exhilarating that you've discovered this, that you put this in the new book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, but how horrifying that if it weren't for you, nobody's writing about this. This is sort of
Yes.
lost. I mean, this is the kind of thing.
Yes.
How is it? And I say this to any pastor listening. If you're
Yes.
looking for something to preach about, my
Mhm.
goodness, this is apologetics of the first water. This is extraordinary. Most people don't know about this.
Right.
Avail yourself of this new book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. This is information that needs to get out to
Absolutely.
skeptics and to people who need encouragement in their faith. These are
Right.
profound things, and I'm just so thrilled. What led you, Dr. Constantinou, to this? I mean, this has been something that's been happening over a number of years, and then it finally clicked. I should write about it.
Yes, for many years, because I've been preaching and teaching about the crucifixion of Christ for a very long time and the trials of Christ. And as an attorney, I was very fascinated in many of the details of the trials. We've been talking about prophecies and other historical things, but there's a lot about Pilate, about the Jewish leaders. It's absolutely fascinating. And so I decided to put this in a book. And as I researched, because I wanted it to be a very strong book, I found out so many things that were quite fascinating, some of the things we're talking about here. But it's also because I'm so disappointed that so many people who are part of my profession, biblical scholars, are so willing to dismiss these things as unhistorical, because they just, I don't know if they don't bother to dig deeply enough, but they don't have a faith perspective at all. So we accept these on the basis of faith, but there's actual historical evidence to support what is in the Gospels, and rather than believing the Gospels as credible sources of historical information, which Roman historians accept, by the way, Bible scholars are just too anxious to prove how open-minded they are and how honest they are and how unbiased they are. They're willing to just say that these things never happened, and I just find that horrific.
Well,
and
they just want to, they just want to be fair to both sides. They have to they have to talk about Satan's point of view. You know what I mean? Hey, hey,
something like that.
why not? Why not?
Yes.
Look,
Yes, but they think that they're more intelligent than the rest of us idiots
no,
who
they don't.
actually
They're
believe the
afraid.
Bible.
They're afraid someone might think they're not that intelligent. So
That's
they
right.
have to pander to the intellectual skeptics.
That's right.
I mean, look, we see this all over the place. I'm more in the evangelical world. I try to steer clear of kind of the main line. God forbid, we're talking about
Right.
mainline Protestant quote unquote theologians, because they're effectively Enlightenment rationalists and agnostics.
So are Catholics, unfortunately, today.
Well,
the same thing, and for
look,
many Catholics. Yeah.
We know this, and we always have to be really clear that there's a ton of bad information out there. I mean, I've seen this in writing most of my books, that people misrepresented Bonhoeffer for decades and decades. These were people that were theologically and politically very liberal, and they profoundly misrepresented him. And I didn't want to correct that. I just thought, I just want to tell the story in a fun, readable way. It's so fascinating and amazing. Yes. And as I did that, bringing ignorance to the table, in a sense, just saying, hey, what do we find? I found things that easily refuted half of what was being put out there. And so, we have a job to do. So we're talking to Eugenia Constantinou. The book is The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. There's more to come. Don't go away. Folks, this is your daily reminder to please go to mypillow.com or mystore.com. And to get huge savings, use the code ERIC. If you don't believe me, here's some celebrity friends.
Mama said to use the code ERIC.
Use the code ERIC.
Eric.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Folks, I hope you're enjoying this half as much as I am. I'm talking to Dr. Eugenia Constantinou, who is a scholar in a number of disciplines, and who's written a wonderful book called The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, The Amazing History and Sublime Mystery of the Passion. Eugenia, I guess I want to say that it seems to me, when I wrote my book, Is Atheism Dead?, there's a parallel in the sense that I think this information has been out there, but no one seems to know about it. And it's about time that we get this information out to people. What I write about in that book is different from what you write, but at the same time, the concept is the same. This is tremendous evidence bolstering the historicity of the scripture, the veracity of the story of Jesus. And so many people, including Christians, especially Christians, are unaware of this. And so it's vital that we get this information out, because I always forget the reference, but where it says in the scripture that, when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord will raise up a standard against it. It feels like the enemy has come in like a flood. The level of skepticism, cultural Marxism has been profound, ridiculous. And yet at the same time, information is coming up through books like ours. So I'm just so excited that now is when you chose to write your book, because people need to read this stuff. So let's just keep going. You talk about the darkness that's referred to. Let's talk about the earthquake.
Yes, the earthquake. The earthquake is harder to document, but that's where Phlegon comes in. Phlegon mentions the earthquake and that cities, buildings were toppled in Bithynia, which is in Asia Minor. So that one has a less of a documentation than the darkness, but nonetheless, it is there.
But Phlegon is not Christian.
That's right. That's right.
So,
exactly.
So he's referencing an actual earthquake.
That's right.
And he's not a Christian, so he is unwittingly bolstering the case for the historicity of the Gospels.
That's right. And he's tying it to the same day as the darkness. You see, that's what's as important. It's not some other earthquake on some other day. It's the day that the darkness happened. So it's a quite extraordinary event that happened. And remember, the ancient people took these things very seriously because they thought of these things as divine signs, not the way we do. We try to explain everything away as a natural occurrence. And of course, especially the darkness was an unnatural darkening. That's the point. The sun does not just go dark for 3 hours and for no reason.
And of course, we know one thing we know, thanks to you, is it wasn't an eclipse. We keep hearing, I've heard many times, it was maybe an eclipse. You're saying no. We can say No,
certainty.
whatever darkness was there, if it was an actual physical darkness, one thing we know is it wasn't the result of an eclipse, because you mentioned the 14th day of Nisan, Passover. It's just not possible to have an eclipse at that time.
Correct. The book explains that, why that's the case. Yes.
There's a lot of other stuff to cover in the book. Now you're writing from a general Christian perspective, but you are yourself a Greek Orthodox Christian. Your husband is a Greek Orthodox priest. You we just have seconds left, but quickly remind me of your biography. You were raised in the church. Did you drift away from the faith at some point, or have you been a Christian your whole life?
I never exactly drifted away from the faith, but I had questions and I had doubts myself. I think that's normal for young people to have doubts. As an older teen, as a young adult, I had doubts about the existence of God. I think that we're very blessed if our parents give us faith of some kind, but then we do have to decide for ourselves whether or not we accept it. So I never had, I never really left. But I was always fascinated by the Bible. I was always fascinated by the law. And I ended up both in the legal field and also in biblical studies. And as a lawyer, I do want some kind of documentation and proof. And so that's part of my, go ahead.
Forgive me, we're out of time. We'll just have to do a second hour, folks. Stick around. The Democrats' big spending socialist agenda is threatening the economy. Americans should be concerned and prepared for the consequences. President Trump ushered in a booming economy, one that is now in jeopardy. It's never been more important to diversify your financial portfolio with gold. When investing in gold and precious metals, the company I trust most is Legacy Precious Metals. They are experts at helping Americans protect and build their wealth. And if you're looking for financial security from a firm you can trust, contact Legacy Precious Metals today. Folks, welcome back. I continue my conversation with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, or as it's properly pronounced, Jeannie Constantinou, or closer to that. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, you are the author most recently of this book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, The Amazing History and Sublime Mystery of the Passion.
Yes.
So what else will we find in this book that we ought to know?
Well, I think you're going to find it very fascinating. Just for example, the description of the temple. And so this was something that, again, we've been hearing about the temple as Christians growing up. We hear about Jesus in the temple, but what the temple was really like, what went on there, why Jesus cleansed the temple, this sort of thing is really important, because what we find is that the important people who are central to the trial and crucifixion of Christ are the chief priests. And the level of corruption among the chief priests and the high priest in first century Judaism is astonishing. And again, all of this information I got from Jewish sources. We have Jewish sources that talk about the corruption and also the other aspects of temple worship that is quite fascinating. And the book describes the temple. What was it really like? If you were to go there, what would you have seen?
Where did you find? What sources did you use? Because no kidding, in my most recent book, I go into the whole temple thing, and I've been reading about it recently, and it really has opened up a whole world to me. So
Yes.
I'm really now hugely excited to read your book just for that. So what sources did you read, and what did you discover?
Of course, we have the first century sources, people like Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus. And also the Mishnah describes certain aspects of temple worship. That's the Jewish, that was the oral law that was later written down after the time of Christ. But also there are modern historians and archaeologists who have recreated this and who discuss this extensively. But usually you have to be a scholar to know how to find this information. And this is why the book is, I think, useful to people, because you don't have to do your own research to try to get to because I mean, there were many things that I learned that I didn't know, and I'm a Bible scholar. So I'm thinking, how is it that I did not know these things? And yet, how can we expect other people to know them? So as you mentioned, it's very important to our faith that we affirm the historicity of the Gospels. I want to give you one thing that I found out that was very fascinating. I had learned this before, but I think you might find this interesting. You know, when Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, he says to the disciples, do you see this? Because they're looking at the temple and it was so beautiful. It was so opulent. He says, there will be not one stone left upon another. And, you know, was his prediction. And I never understood why that was the case, because as a Greek, you know, and I know, we have a lot of temples that are still standing. Even the temple, of Athena in Athens, the Parthenon is still, even though it was blown up, by when the Turks were storing gunpowder there. That's right. Nonetheless, it's still standing. So how is it that the temple at Jerusalem, there's nothing left of it, not even one stone? Jesus's prophecy was fulfilled exactly the way he said. Well, that's because there was so much gold in the temple that when the temple caught fire because the Jews rebelled against the Romans, all of the gold that was embellishing the temple melted, and it ran in between the cracks of the stones. And after the war was over, after the Romans left, people went and they scavenged the site and they took it apart stone by stone.
Now, where did you find that? Because I write about this in my book. I remember hearing this years ago.
Yes.
But never hearing anything in 30 years since. So I looked into it in my book, and I'm curious
I'm trying to remember now where I read about that. I don't remember where I read about that.
But the fact is, it makes logical sense. I mean, when I discovered in my own research, the amount of gold.
Yes.
It is almost unbelievable. And I'm not kidding. When I was reading it, I thought to myself, this can't be right.
Yeah.
But this is what the sources say.
That's right.
That this was a level of opulence, because we have to remember King Herod, who was a bum, he wanted to use the taxpayers' money to burnish his own reputation.
That's right.
With the Jewish people who rightly hated him. So he thought, I'm going to build something, a monument to my own ego, to my own. And it was a level of opulence that it's basically unimaginable to us. Yes. And so when we think about 70 AD, this building is set aflame. I mean, it really, once you begin digging into it, it just becomes more and more fascinating. So you're corroborating what I discovered.
That's right.
That people wanted gold. A tiny bit of gold is tremendously valuable, and it was everywhere. It had just, I mean, I looked into what is the temperature to melt gold. It's a high temperature, but it's just absolutely fascinating.
Yes, and not only the gold itself, in the embellishments, in the structure itself, and all of the doors, and there were a number of doors. So we think of like a big church, but the temple was a huge complex. And it was inside. The way I describe how you approach the temple, you could enter into the mountain and go through the center of the mountain and come out on the top of the Temple Mount. It was fascinating. But remember that there was also a huge amount of coinage there. There were so many coins that even long before the time of Christ, Roman historians talk about the opulence of the temple and the fact that there's so much coinage there, it couldn't even be counted. So when Jesus cleanses the temple, this is something else I think Christians should realize. It's not that he just kind of lost his temper and decided to trash the temple. There's a reason, there's a prophetic message that he was giving, and he was speaking against the corruption of the chief priests. So it's not correct that the Jewish people put Jesus to death, but it was a very small group of Jewish leaders who were threatened because they had their power and their wealth, because they controlled the temple and all of the buying and the selling of the animals and the money changing and things like this. So Jesus was a real threat to them. They didn't want to lose the control and the power that they had. And that power flowed from the temple. So that's a big part of the story. And the role of the chief priest specifically in the crucifixion of Jesus is quite key. But no Jew would be surprised to hear this, because it was widely well known. It's well known in Judaism how corrupt the chief priests were during the first century. And this is the reason many Jews believe that God allowed the temple to be destroyed. From our perspective as Christians, Christ is the temple. And this is why he said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So the temple was the presence of God on earth for Jews. But when Christ was incarnate, he becomes the presence of God on earth. And this is why he calls himself the temple. And also, we have not only the fact that the temple is the presence of God, it is the only Jewish temple in the entire world, the only place where animal sacrifice could be offered. And it was also the largest temple complex in the entire world, as you mentioned, because Herod the Great had decided to enshrine his legacy through the embellishment and enlargement of the temple precincts.
Well, what I found, I mean, there is so much here. And again, I'm just so thrilled that you've written about this. The book's Crucifixion of the King of Glory, Jeannie Constantinou. But I think to myself, when Jesus said, again, this is all about context. You know, when sometimes you read something in Gospels, you go, yeah, I've heard it a million times. When you understand the majesty of these buildings, anyone there would have been in awe. I mean, just absolutely in awe. So when Jesus says all these buildings will be torn down, not a stone will be left on the other, anyone would think he's absolutely crazy. He's an insane radical. He's dangerous. He's blasphemous. People have to understand when he said that prophetically, because of course, a few, 40 years later, that's precisely what happened.
Right. That's right.
The power of those words, it's basically impossible for us to understand unless we get the background. And that's why I hope people will buy the book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. We'll be back. Final segment with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Don't go away. Hey folks, Eric Metaxas here. Before taking Nutrimetics, I looked and felt, well, like this. And now look at me. Nutrimetics all-natural supplements enhance immunity, energy, overall health, and they might even cure baldness.
It doesn't cure baldness.
Whatever. The point is, if you want to feel great, go to Nutrimetics.com and use the code ERIC for huge savings. Folks, I have the joy of speaking with Jeannie Constantinou, Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, who's written a book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, The Amazing History and Sublime Mystery of the Passion. Beautiful book. This is something that I don't know how many Greeks listen to this program, but if you know anybody, if you're Greek or you know someone who is Greek and they're not sure where they stand with the faith, or, tell them, you dare them to read this book or buy a copy.
Or any Christian.
Well, no, of course. But I'm saying specifically, I know how many Greeks go to church. They think of themselves as Orthodox Christians, but they're not sure. They're oftentimes maybe afraid to ask questions. They think that's bad form. I'll just keep my mouth shut. And I want everyone to understand the facts, the information. It is so powerful. Do not deprive yourself of this, because when life is tough, you need to know that God is real, not hope that he's real or hope this is stuff, but to know, and this will help you to know. So we just have a few minutes left. What else can we talk about that's in this book, Dr. Constantinou, that we haven't yet touched on?
Well, one of the things might be Pilate, because a lot of people have questions about Pilate, or Judas. People have questions about Judas and his motivation, about the wounds that were suffered by Christ. There's so much that we talk about. The trial. I go through the trial of Christ step by step, the Jewish trial and then the Roman trial, and how is it that the Jewish leaders finally convinced Pilate to sentence Jesus to death. This is one of the things that I think is also very hotly disputed by many Bible scholars. Because the Gospels portray Pilate as being reluctant to put Jesus to death. All four Gospels do. And Pilate was known for being a very, very tough governor, prefect of Judea. So many people say, oh, this isn't right. This can't be true. But I go through it in the book step by step of why it is true that Pilate was actually very reluctant to put Jesus to death. But it's for reasons of Jewish law and also for sort of Roman cultural reasons that might surprise people.
Well, it is fascinating because, again, the more you learn about this, the more it makes sense. That's what's so interesting.
Exactly.
You realize that that everybody is on tenterhooks, that they're afraid. Everybody's working in fear. This is like this demonic, hierarchy, right? Everybody's afraid that they are going to be crushed by if they step out of line. So you have every one of the Jewish leaders who have tremendous power that's been given to them by the Romans. They don't want that to be blown up. And if anybody's going to blow it up, it's this Jesus figure. He's going to screw it up. So they have to wipe him out. He is their enemy. But then you have the Romans at the same time thinking, well, if we are too harsh with the Jews, if we don't play ball, they will rebel. So the whole thing is just a simmering cauldron.
That's right.
And into this comes Jesus. And it is really just astonishing when we see a figure like you mentioned, Pilate. He really doesn't want to be involved. I mean, he literally washes his hands publicly to say, I have nothing to do with this.
That's right.
Talk more about why the Jews had to appeal to him to put Jesus to death. Why couldn't they do it themselves?
Well, they didn't have the legal right to put him to death. There was one exception to putting somebody to death, and I talk about that in the book. It's if they violated the sacred precincts of the temple, but they didn't have the legal right. But they also don't want to put Jesus to death because they want Jesus to be completely discredited. And there was nothing like crucifixion, the shame and humiliation of crucifixion, which would prove to the Jews that Jesus was a false prophet. You see, most of the Jewish people believed Jesus really was the Messiah. At that time, they believed that because of all the signs he did, because of all the miracles that he did. This is
wait. That's a major point. What you just said. Most people don't know this. I think I've only discovered this myself by reading a book by my friend John Rankin. But the idea that, I mean, when we think of Jesus coming on the foal of a donkey and people saying Hosanna, Hosanna.
Right.
I mean, we forget that yes, the people of Jerusalem actually believed our Messiah has come. So this is a nightmare for the Jewish leadership.
That's right, because they don't want rebellion. The Jewish leaders worked very closely with Rome, and this is not just in Judea, but everywhere in the Roman Empire. This is how the Romans kept their control. They worked hand in glove with the aristocracy all over the Roman Empire to keep the ordinary people suppressed. And the aristocracy benefited from this relationship with Rome, but their job was to keep people under control and to keep them paying their Roman taxes and submissive to Rome. So, but the whole point is this: why did people believe that Jesus was the Messiah? And they did. Otherwise, if Jesus were not a threat, people didn't think he was a Messiah, he would not have been put to death by the Jewish leaders. So why did they think he was a Messiah? Because he had long hair and a nice robe? It's because he did the signs, because he gave sight to the blind and the deaf heard and the lame walked, and he raised people from the dead, and not once or twice, but thousands of people over the course of 3 years. So we have to recognize that even though people might doubt the miracles of Christ, the very fact that the Jewish people knew the prophecies in Isaiah, they knew what kinds of things the Messiah would do. And Jesus did all those things, and no one had before, and no one has since. So this is why they believed him to be the Messiah. And this is why he was a threat to the Jewish leaders. Now, the Jewish leaders didn't know that Jesus did not have political ambitions, so they really saw him as a threat. But this is why they decide they have to put him to death by crucifixion. This is why they want the Romans to do it. First, they can distance themselves from Jesus's death because he was popular. They didn't want to be responsible. But also, if he were crucified, they could point to that and say, you see, he was cursed by God because of the statement in Deuteronomy, cursed is anyone who hangs on the tree. And it was very effective because to this day, if you ask most Jewish people why they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, it's because he died on the cross. And so they presume that this means that he was cursed by God. They don't understand the meaning of the cross as a Christian would understand it, not just the payment of debt or something like that, but the depth of the love and humility of God. That's really the meaning of the cross, that he would do anything for us, and that even submit to the cross, like St. Paul says in Philippians chapter 2.
It's such powerful stuff.
Mhm.
And the only way you can avoid it is to avoid it, because when you look at it, it is really, it is just, it's astonishing. I mean, I think that the evidence for the historicity of the scriptures, the evidence for Jesus as Messiah and God, all of this evidence is really
Yes.
overwhelming. It
Yes.
has become overwhelming. When I think of books like yours now, um, we have no excuse, folks. This is really
Mhm.
dramatic, that the evidence more than ever is available to us. You don't need to be a scholar.
That's right.
You know, you just need to get a copy of this book and look into this for yourself and see what you make of it. But I am myself amazed at how now, you know, in what look like to be some kind of approach to the last days, as things go crazy, the evidence for God,
That's
it
right.
just becomes more and more dramatic. And what you're writing about, I mean, you've only touched on a number of things,
Yes.
but there's much more. But I think our faith needs this kind of
Yes.
bolstering.
Yes, it does. It does, because the culture is attacking us. And you mentioned about Greek Orthodox. I don't think that anymore that Greek Orthodox are afraid to ask questions. They have questions and they do ask questions. The problem is, where do you get the answers? Because it took me a long time to write this book, and I did a lot of research, and I have a background in it. So rather than people trying to get the answers for themselves, which is almost impossible unless you know where to look, unless you have the background and the research ability and the time, it's very difficult for people to answer those questions. So what they hear in the culture is that these things never happened. Jesus never really healed anybody. Sometimes people say Jesus didn't even really exist as a historical person.
Right.
You know, so people don't really know. They want answers. And I also want to say that as a lawyer, I'm a skeptic by nature. That's kind of my thing. I really do want some kind of evidence, and I think there's a lot of evidence for Christ, a lot of evidence for the truthfulness of the Gospels, and so I can understand why people have questions, but they don't really know where to go for answers. So hopefully this book will help people, at least in terms of the passion, the trials, and the crucifixion of Christ, get answers not only from a spiritual perspective, but also from a historical and a cultural and a legal perspective that explains a lot of things. That's sort of like behind the scenes expose of what really happened.
Is there a website where people can find you? Just a few seconds left.
Oh, well, I do have a website. It's drjeannie.com. Unfortunately, that the book is not on the website.
It
You
doesn't
get the
matter.
book-
drjeannie.com is the website, and the book is, folks, you got to get it. The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. Dr. Constantinou, just a joy to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me.